Well, I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about all the things I didn't learn growing up. Actually, I'm going to talk about the things that I didn't learn growing up and hopefully share with you some tips of some things that you can do right now, no matter what stage in life you were at, so that you can have a great and successful future. So to start out, I thought I'd give you a little bit of, whoops, let me see if it's going to work here. Maybe this isn't going to work. Okay, well, we'll just do it this way. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of background. I grew up in a little community. My hometown is Aberdeen, Idaho. This is a little farming community. And I grew up about 1.5 miles from the town. And this was my elementary school. It was the same grade school that my father went to school in when he was growing up. And this was my high school. It's changed quite a bit since then. But I grew up on a dairy farm. And one of the things that we learned is we learned to work hard. My mother and father bought this small dairy farm and worked very hard during their life to be able to pay for the farm and to provide a good way of life for us in our family. And so that was my growing up days. My family, my father was a farmer, my mother was a homemaker, had been a librarian before marrying. I had 4 siblings, 3 brothers and a sister. So that gives you a little bit of background in my life. But there were some really wonderful principles that my parents taught me. So when I say there were things I didn't learn growing up, I don't want you to think that my parents didn't teach us important things that relate to finance, because they did. They taught us about working hard and learning to save money. My mother and father were really good at that. And I always wondered how my father ever did it, because it was a small farm. It wasn't a really large farm. We had neighbors that owned hundreds and hundreds of acres of land and farmed, dry farmed, or they farmed irrigated with sprinkler systems and things, and they had huge farms. But ours was just a small dairy farm. And Dad always taught us about paying cash, shopping around, being frugal. My mom was great at being frugal, and planning for emergencies. So those were really basic principles that were important for me to know, and I think are important for all families to know. But one of the things I felt like my dad really stressed to all of us was, if you don't have the money, you don't buy it. And so he had accounts at the local gas company and other merchants in the area where he would buy his farm supplies and things like that. And then at the end of the season, if we were harvesting our grain or our potatoes or our hay, then he would pay for those things at the end of the season. So that was his form of credit. But my father, till he was in his 90s, never had a credit card. He died about 5 years ago. So kind of interesting how he managed his finances throughout those years. And one of the things I remember growing up is that he bought a new car every few years, and he always paid cash. And to the day he died, he'd never paid for a car on credit, which I thought was amazing. But we had, our old farm trucks, and he would learn to fix things and make things do. And so he was very, very frugal in that regard. But this is one of the principles that I carried to my adulthood with me. Now, there were some weaknesses in my financial management skills growing up. As children and teens, we didn't talk much about specific budgeting techniques or anything like that with our parents. They managed the finances, but we didn't really talk about it, nor did we always see how they did it. So that was a weakness for me. We watched them, and we knew that they were frugal because they would, talk about how we needed to be careful about our money, or that, we didn't buy things if we didn't have the cash at the time. We didn't put anything on credit for our household goods or anything like that. And so when I became an adult, there was a lot of gaps in my experience. So then I went to college. So I had to go away from home to go to college to go to school. And that's when the financial management, the lack of knowledge or whatever kind of kicked in. I lived with other roommates. I had to think about, okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to manage my budget? My parents had been really good to us. We'd worked really hard in our growing up years, and so our father had paid for our education and provided, kind of a living stipend or allowance for us to be able to take care of our basic needs while we were away at college. But knowing really how to manage that and having a budget in college, I really didn't really know how to do that very well. And I just knew I needed to make sure that there was enough in the bank account, that I didn't bounce any checks. And that was back in the times of checks. For those of you that are too young to have ever experienced that, checks were our form of payment. So I lived with roommates. Then I had to start figuring out things. Okay, we're going to share the groceries. And so, okay, how are we going to do that? How are we going to pay for those bills? How do we pay for the utilities in our apartment? Who was going to have their name on the contract with the landlord? Or was it that we signed a contract individually? In some apartments that I lived in, that was one of the things that happened, is that we each had our own contract and we paid our own electricity and those kinds of things. Other times it was, okay, we did it together. So somebody had to have their name on the phone bill and somebody had to have their name on the light bill, and then everybody paid them, which became another kind of a challenge in the whole budgeting and planning, because you had to make sure that everybody's paying their fair share or it was a problem. So that's when I really started thinking, wow, there's a lot I don't know. My first year in college, I didn't work, but the next year I did. And one of the things that I learned was the importance of starting to save. So my parents had always talked about savings. In fact, I brought my first little, it was a bank. I don't know if anyone would recognize this, but this was my first Security Bank savings. And it was a little bank, and I could put money in it, and my mother would take me to the bank, and they had the key to open it, and then I would put the money in my little bank account, and then I would take it home, and I'd fill it up again and take it back. And that was kind of my first experience with saving as a child. So I did learn some things about saving. But I remember that when I was after I was in college a year or so, I went home, and I got invited to become an Avon lady in the summer. And so I signed up and I became an Avon lady in the rural community, and I visited all these people. And my dad let me use his car, and he didn't really talk too much about it, but he did say, well, if this was a legitimate business, you'd be paying for the gas and you'd be paying for all of the other expenses that go along with this business. But he kind of funded the bill in a sense, and so most of the money that I earned, I was able to have and take and use for my college the next year. Another job that I had in the summer was working at the potato processing plant. And I don't know if you've ever experienced that in your lives, ladies and gentlemen, but it's not something that I decided I want to do for my life, so I really wanted an education. Because I picked rotten potatoes off of this conveyor belt from 11 p.m. till 7 a.m., for about 3 months before the potato processing plant closed for the summer. But it was a great education in teaching me, it's hard work. It's hard making a living. And I looked at people who were there with me in that setting that were doing this every day of their lives to provide for their families. And I thought, I think I want to be somewhere else. I want to have a different kind of outcome. So I wanted an education. And so that was a good thing that I did learn. And my parents had really encouraged us to get an education. So that was, again, a very important basic thing that I learned growing up. But there were 5 things that I didn't learn. But let me just first say, my lack of knowledge made me really cautious. If I could save money, I did it. But I didn't really know anything about investing, because my dad really hadn't talked about that. His investment was his farm. And that's literally until later years, I didn't see him investing in other things, having money to invest in other things, like you and I think about for our retirement. I didn't feel confident in making large purchases. It really made me nervous, and I would worry if I had to buy something that cost very much money, because I didn't know how to weigh my options. And so I'd shop around, and then I couldn't decide, and I'd go home, and then I'd shop around. And so I hadn't had a lot of experience in managing money growing up. So I didn't feel confident with my own management skills in doing that, especially making purchases. I was reluctant to risk investing in real estate or other wealth building strategies for a long time, because I hadn't seen my dad do it, and he hadn't talked about the process he went through when he did it, he and my mom. And I felt nervous at times, thinking that it was okay to use my savings for things I wanted to do, because I was nervous. What if I don't have enough, you know? So those were some things, some kind of fears that I brought to my money management. Whoa, let's move on. Okay, so these are 5 things that I wish I had known growing up. The first one is how to create a financial plan for life. I hadn't had my parents sit down and talk to me about, they talked to me about educationally what did I want to do, but they never sat down and said, well, what do you want to have when you're, what are things that you want to accomplish in your life financially? Where do you want to be in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years? I didn't know where I wanted to be. I hadn't even really thought about it that way, in that perspective. The next thing is how to create and follow a basic budget. And I'm going to talk about each one of these, okay? I didn't really know how to do that. And I was visiting with my sister, who's 8 years younger, and I said, what do you wish you'd learned? And she said, I wished I'd had some more knowledge about basic budgeting techniques and skills. I really didn't know either. So it wasn't just me that missed it. I think everybody in our family did. How to start planning early for retirement and investing. How to make credit work for me so that it could be an advantage to me rather than a disadvantage. And the last thing is how to plan for my bucket list and have fun. So let's first talk about the first one. It's really important wherever you're at this point in time. It doesn't matter. If you're older or if you're younger, take time to sit down and say, what is my plan financially for my life? Do I want to be able to buy a home? Do I want to be able to buy a new car and pay for it and not have to put it on credit? Do I want to be able to take a trip or to travel, do humanitarian things or charitable work? What do I want to be able to do financially? So I had a plan designed for myself, so I knew where the money was supposed to go. When I first started making money, and I got my first teaching job, and I had the paycheck coming in, it was like I really didn't have a plan. I knew I wanted to make sure I could pay all my bills. That wasn't a problem, because my father had always taught me to be responsible. But I really didn't know, how much should I be saving, and should I be saving for certain types of things? And so sometimes I would spend and make some poor decisions about how I used my money. So this is one thing that I thought would have really been great. And I would suggest to all of you that they need to be SMART goals, in that you have decided a very specific goal that you have in mind. It needs to be measurable. You need to know, okay, by what date or what period of my life do I want to be there? What do I want to have in 15 years? Do I want to have my house paid off? Or do I want to have so much money set aside for retirement? Or when do I want to retire? Or those kinds of things. I wanted it to be achievable. I couldn't say, I'm going to save $60,000 in 3 years, because that was totally not possible at the point I was at. Now, maybe some people would have the ability to do that, depending on what they are doing with their finances and their investments and things, but I wouldn't have had that. Realistic, needs to be realistic, and it needs to fit your value system. Needed to fit my value system, and it needed to be time-based, as I mentioned. So I love this little quote that I saw years ago. It said, a goal without a plan is just a wish. Until you've written it down, it really isn't a plan. And I needed this plan in order to then move on to the basic budget that I wished I'd known about, how to do that. Because your goals and your life plan should be built into your budget. And that was one of the things I don't think that I really made that connection as well as I could have early on. Having a monthly plan for your spending is really, really important. And I found that that became extremely important. I needed to figure out what were my fixed expenses, like my rent or my house payment, my utility bills, if I had a car payment or other kinds of loans or anything like that that I was paying on. I needed to know what those fixed expenses were that came every month that I had to pay them. And then I needed to think about, okay, now this is how much money I have left in my budget, how much have I got for my flexible expenses, and what are my flexible expenses? Every household's expenses in this area are different. I was single for many years, and so I didn't have children that I was funding. I didn't have a husband that I was working with to manage my money. It was up to me to do it, okay? So those were things that I felt like were important, and I needed to understand how much do I have coming in, and what are my needs, and then what are my wants, and how am I going to fund my wants. The other thing that I felt was really critical that I wished I had done earlier was that I had set aside a plan to save. Now, I saved every month. I was pretty good about that, but I didn't have a set amount, and I didn't always do it at the first of the month. I used to say, well, if there's some left over at the end of the month, I'm going to save it then. But in reality, you need to pay yourself first, because then if there's emergencies that come up, you can use that emergency fund to pay that, but if not, that fund is there to start building an emergency fund for later times and also for those goals or things that you really care about. One of the other things I felt was really important in my budgeting was to decide, okay, I have an emergency fund, I have maybe a fund of things that like if I wanted to take a trip or I wanted to do something like that, I needed to fund that. I needed to plan for that each month because I didn't want to be borrowing from my emergency fund to go on a trip with my friends. You know, those kinds of things. So that was one of the things that I learned that I needed to do. And then to plan for irregular expenses. There's expenses that come only once or twice a year, like birthdays, anniversaries, taxes, registering your car, you know, paying for your kids' schooling, whatever. And I had to take a look in my own life and say, what are those irregular expenses that only come once or twice a year, and how have I planned to pay for those? Because they weren't in my normal monthly budget, right? So one of the things that I learned to do that's been just a neat thing, but I learned this a while later, I didn't learn this in my early 20s, is that I would sit down and I'd say, okay, these are the expenses I have in the year, and how much am I going to spend on them? So for gift giving, I found that my poor housing budget for saving for a house was going to gifts to my nieces and nephews. And so I finally had to step back and say, wait a minute, what's my real goal here? Do I want a house, or do I just want them to know that I love them a lot? And so that was one of the things that I took a look at and said, all right, I have to set a certain amount of money for gift giving, and that was my limit, and I couldn't spend more than that. And that way, I could fund my house fund to the side. And that was one of the things that I learned. One thing I did learn, though, growing up, or in my early adult years, was it was really cheaper to live with other people than it was to live by myself. And I was able to save quite a bit of money toward a house down payment because I had other people that I lived with, and we shared the rent and the utilities and those kinds of things. And so that made renting affordable for quite a while before I actually did buy a home. And that was really an advantage. Having a plan to pay yourself first, that was one of the things that I learned that really became more beneficial. And I made sure that it was something that I could have taken out and put in a savings account right at the first of the month. Because if I waited till the end of the month, I could always find some way to spend it. And so that was one of the things that really helped me that way with budgeting. And then I learned a few other tools that I have found to be invaluable. But some of them I learned the hard way. But, you know, thinking about now if I've got my goals, so when I finally started, you know, writing these goals out and thinking about what I'm trying to fund, then I had to take a look and say, all right, what am I doing when I buy? Am I thinking about those goals when I go to the kitchen gadget store? I love kitchen gadget stores, ladies and gentlemen. I want you to know it. I love these things. And I could just spend my day in there looking and thinking, oh, I'd love to have this and I'd love to have that. And at first, I was single and I was just not having to report to anybody else, so I would buy these things. But one of the things I started thinking about is, how are they helping me reach my goals? And did I really need them? So these were some questions I asked myself. And I'm sorry I didn't put them up here for you to see, so if you just want to kind of jot them down. But one was, is this purchase helping me reach my goal? My goals, or my specific goal that I'm really working on right now. Do I really need it? What's the purpose for me buying this? Is it just for fun? Is it something that I will use? And that was one of the other things I started asking myself in the kitchen gadget store, which really has helped me a lot in the years, is how many times am I going to use this? If I'm only going to use it once or twice, do I really need it? Or could I borrow it from a friend or my mother or somebody else and not buy it? That was one of the things I had to think about. Because the other thing you have to think about is when you buy, you have to store it. And you have to have room. So think about that. We fill our homes pretty full of things because we have to store things that maybe we're only going to use once or twice. So that was another question I asked. So do I really need it? How many times am I going to use it? Is there another form I could use instead? And then is it something that I really want and really care about? Then I can decide if it's really worth the effort. And I'll just give you a quick little example. I remember I was going to a conference, and I thought it was a dressy affair for a dinner, and so I thought I had to have a really fancy dress. And I went looking, and I kind of waited a while to do this. And so I was getting close to the time when I was to go to this conference, and I hadn't purchased a dress yet, and I was getting kind of worried. So then what do you do when you're worried and it's like the pressure's on? You just say, whatever I can find, right? Doesn't matter how much it costs. So I bought this dress, and I really didn't like the dress, but I knew that it would work for what I was going for. So I went to the conference, I wore the dress, and I was there with hundreds of other people who really could have cared less what I wore. And I thought, oh, as I look at what everyone else wore, I probably had 5 or 6 things in my closet I could have worn instead. And I felt so sad because I really never wore that dress again. And I'd paid a lot of money for it. And I thought, I don't want to make those kinds of choices. So when I have to make choices, now I say to myself, all right, is there an option? Do I have an alternative? And if I don't, I try to think far enough in advance to be looking for something that's going to meet the need less expensively. And that's helped me a lot, save a lot of money in my years. So it's really important to think about, he who does not need but buys steals really from himself. I was stealing from myself. I was stealing from other things I cared about. Okay, the next thing I wished I had been smarter about was how to start a retirement plan early. When I first started teaching, they would advertise these retirement seminars through the school district and other places. And even when I started working with Utah State University Extension, they'd have these retirement seminars. Well, we had some older ladies in our office who went to these. And I thought it was because they were getting ready to retire. I kind of had that philosophy. So I didn't go. And that was a mistake. I should have been going to every single one of those retirement seminars because I would have been learning things then that would have helped me save a whole lot more money and make a whole lot more opportunities available to myself for even investing. If I would have been smart enough to go to those meetings early on and learn the techniques and the tips. So don't go to the meetings, just because, or don't not go to the meetings because just the old people go. You go and you learn as much as you can. And that really taught me also to always be looking for other avenues of information out in the community where I could learn and grow and develop my skills and confidence. I think that's one of the biggest things is a lot of times we're not confident in making our financial choices and decisions. And so we hold back. And I was a very conservative person. So I would be very conservative in kinds of investments and things I made because I I didn't want to risk. I was afraid to risk. And I look back now and I think, oh, I should have taken a few more risks, you know? It would have made a big difference. Okay, and then not only get the information, but then start practicing it. Start saving every month, as I mentioned. Learn investment strategies, and then take a look at all the options you have. If you work in an employer, in a situation where your employer pays you anything toward retirement, and they will match any of your funds, make sure you match it to the maximum amount. And if you can, pay in as to the limit that it will allow you to pay. Okay, because for example, ours, it would allow me to pay in 5% and they would match that, and then I could put up to 10% in. Well, that was one of the things that I did learn to do, and that really made a big difference in the kinds of retirement that I will have when I retire, because I started doing that. But that's something that you need to do, and if you're not doing it and you've never been doing it, now's the time to find out. And make sure that you signed up correctly, because some people think, oh yeah, I've signed in, I opted for that automatic saving to go into my retirement, and then sometimes they didn't actually finish signing the paperwork, and it's not actually happening, but they think it is. So that's something to be aware of. Look at the ability to invest in IRAs and other kinds of things like that. And then start looking at maybe your game is real estate or something like that. I had a young woman who worked with me, and she and her husband bought this really inexpensive little house in the central part of Salt Lake. Little teeny house. And they fixed it up, and they fixed it really nice, and then the market dropped, and there was another little house that was just the same size as their house, that was almost the same floor plan. They bought that house because it was so cheap, and they'd been really frugal. They had enough money. They bought that house. They moved into that house, rented the other one for more than their mortgage payment was on the little one, the first little one, and they kept doing that. Within just a few years, they were able to buy a very nice home down in Highland, and they've continued, their real estate investment future. Well, that's something that I was shy to do, and so that wasn't something that was particularly something that I felt comfortable doing growing up after I became an adult. But that's something you could think about. Okay, the next thing is how to make credit work for you. Well, for me, I was pretty cautious about credit. I told you that my dad had always been very cautious, and he told us not to buy anything we couldn't pay for. So I believed that philosophy. I loved that philosophy. But I also knew that there were times when you had to have credit in order to be able to progress in many ways. So I did get a credit card through my bank because I'd had a good banking history at the bank. And that would be something that I think is really important to realize, is that the things that we do with our bank accounts in a banking institution are powerful, because they give you a basis for that institution for being willing to give you credit if you need it, if you've always managed your bank and savings, your checking and savings accounts well. You're not overdrafting all the time, and you're not causing other kinds of things like that. Some people have had issues with banking institutions. Maybe they've had difficulty in the past. The thing to do would be to really work hard at getting, making, in a sense, restitution to the institution, and get yourself in a position where you can have a good relationship with a banking institution, because that's really powerful. Then the next thing is that once you get credit, you have to think about how are you going to use it wisely. Okay, my parents bought their farm, and then they saved money, and my father actually built our home. And so we lived in this little farmhouse, this little teeny old farmhouse, until I was 8. And then my father, they had saved enough money, and he built us a nice home. But the thing is, I did never see him talk too much about a mortgage or anything like that. So I didn't really know much about that as a young adult. Okay, how do I buy a house? And those are things that I had to learn, was what's the process. And I'll give you a little plug. We have a homebuyer education course that's available online through Utah State University Extension, and also available in-house here in Salt Lake and in Weber County, a couple of places, and up in Logan. But the thing that you need to do is you need to learn about What is the process for buying a house? I needed to learn that. How do I work with a lender, and how do I work with a realtor and all of those other people to help me? But I didn't know that growing up. How to buy a car. We were one of those kids that drove the clunkers to school. 4 of us were in high school at the same time, and so we shared a car. And then when I got older, my brother had a car, and when he was ready to get a new car because he was out and working, I bought his car, and so then I drove that car for a long time before I ever got another car. And then, even then, I wasn't as confident as I should have been. And I took my dad with me to buy my car because I didn't feel confident enough to do it on my own. That's changed since. But those were some things that he didn't really teach me how to do it. He did it well, but I didn't know how to do it. And then learning how to protect credit. So I got a credit card and I used it, and I would pay off the bill and that kind of thing. And that's one of the things is that sometimes you think you have to carry a balance to build a credit score, and that's not true. If you have credit and you use it wisely, I can pay off my credit card every single month at the end of the month and never pay any kind of interest, and I can have a really good credit score, okay? Because it shows that I'm responsible with my debt. One of the things that is so important that a lot of us don't recognize is that when you have credit, if you carry, let's say you have a credit card and you carry a balance on that credit card, you're paying a lot of interest for the use of somebody else's money. So if you can avoid doing that, then that can be more powerful, because then the money that's coming in next month doesn't go away before you even get the rest of your bills paid, but it can go toward the things that you really care about. So learning to, as the women talked earlier today, learning to live within your means and learning to spend less than you earn can be such a powerful thing. But sometimes you do have to have debt. So the idea is pay it off as quickly as you can. Always make more than the minimum payment on any kind of credit. That was one thing that I've seen to be really powerful in my work. As I've learned about financial management and teach it to others now, that's one of the things that's so powerful is learn to pay off your debt as quickly as you can. Even a $2 or $3 or $5 or $10 extra a month will make a world of difference. But you want to protect your credit, so you don't want to damage it in like carrying too high of balances according to your limits, or not paying your bills on time, or things like that. Those are really important to remember. Learn strategies for building wealth through good credit. My friend who bought the home and then she bought another one, they learned to use credit to their advantage so that they could build their own wealth. And we can do that in lots of different ways. So be aware of that. How do you build a good credit score? Paying on time. Don't have late payments. If you've had problems in the past, start paying and having a good record from now on, and that will make a real difference in building your credit. There are certain types of credit that is more powerful than others. Closed-ended credit, like a car loan or something like that, that gives you that's a better score builder than is a credit card that you got at the local furniture store or at the local department store where you're buying clothing or things like that. So that's something to be aware of. Don't hurt your future buying power by decisions you make with credit. Let me give you a quick example. I had a young woman that came to one of my classes, and she wanted to buy a house. And in the process of trying to qualify for a loan, she found out that she couldn't. And the reason was not because she hadn't a good job, nor hadn't paid all of her bills on time and everything, but several years before, she had a brother who wanted to buy a house. He didn't have quite enough money or quite as good a credit score as he needed, and he asked his sister to co-sign on his loan. And she agreed, and he always paid the loan in full every month. So there was no problem with that. But guess what? When she went to that lender and wanted to buy a house, what did they say? You have a house. You've already bought a house, because she was on that loan. So that's one of the things that you want to do, is you be really careful about ever co-signing on a loan with someone else. Family members, we love them dearly, but they can really drain our bank accounts dry if they don't pay their bills. and we then become responsible for them. And it also drops the credit. Another little technique we learned, about home buying was that if you have a car payment that you're making on a regular basis, that's building your credit score. But if 2 months before you go to buy that house, you decide, oh, I'm going to hurry and pay this car loan off and get rid of that bill, right? Well, what that does is that now drops that line of credit off your credit history, and so it now has dropped your credit score. And then that means a higher interest rate possibly for your loan. So there's some things like that. If you're continuing to pay on time, pay on that loan just as you were until you get the house paid, get into it, then you can pay off your car loan if it normally wouldn't have been paid off for a few months. So some things, little techniques like that are really powerful. But one of the things that I did mention earlier is if you have debt, make sure that you are paying down as much as you can, as quickly as you can, because then that gives you money to do other things in your life. And you don't want to be a slave to debt. Avoid alternative forms of credit, like we talked about payday lenders out there, vehicle title loans and those kinds of things. Be really cautious about those. There are times, I know that there are people who literally have had those and have had to use those sources because of no other option. But if you can learn to save a little bit, pay yourself a little bit, always have an emergency fund, then those things can really make a difference in what you're doing. Okay, the last thing is, just remember, compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it, by investing and, setting things away. I have to tell you, saving in a savings account is not going to get you a lot of interest these days, okay? So you're going to have to find some other ways. But he who doesn't pays it, okay? Okay, so how could I plan for my bucket list? I wanted to have, and I do have a bucket list of things I want to be able to accomplish in my life. And I've been accomplishing them along the way. But early on, I didn't really sit down and make out my bucket list. And, I'm going to retire one day. And some people have said, what are you going to do when you retire? And I said, I wish I was as clear on that idea as I could be, because I really hadn't planned maybe as well as I wished I had for some of those things. One of the things that I struggled with, as I mentioned, that sometimes it was hard for me to feel like I could spend on fun because I wanted to make sure that I had enough for retirement kind of thing. So I would suggest you make that bucket list early, or whatever stage you're at. Take time now to make that bucket list. And take some time in your budget planning to plan a little category called fun. Because if you don't put any money into a little fund to do something you enjoy, one day you're going to be just really frustrated and you're going to go blow your budget and go do something that is not a wise choice, perhaps, just because you feel deprived. So don't deprive yourself. Plan for times to play and to have fun and to enjoy life along the way, but don't do it and not pay your bills, because that's important that you're paying your bills so that you can take care of your financial situation, keep your credit in good shape, and those types of things. So there's some things that somebody told me this, and I thought, this is such a great idea, and this is such a good thing for us to do, is don't be afraid to enjoy life now. Use annual leave. I had people tell me that the time to do the things on your bucket list are before you retire. And a lot of other people say, oh, you do it after you retire. Well, I've seen a lot of people who've passed away right after they've retired. So they missed out on that. But the other thing is that look at the advantages of doing it while you're employed. If you have an annual leave, you have paid leave, right? Your trip is paid in a sense for the time that you're traveling or doing whatever you want to do. The other thing is that you have health and group life insurance while you're working, hopefully, with your employer, right? So that's a good time to go. Not when you're having to fund all of that on your own after retirement. And then create a category in your budget, as I said, for fun or entertainment, so that you can start enjoying and participating in the fun things in life now. Now, for some of you, this may seem like, I'm never going to have money to do those kinds of things. I want you to know that if you will set up a little savings for yourself at the beginning of every month, it's amazing. You know, people say, I can't save anything. And I say, could you save $20 a month? How much would that be in a year? $240. Who can't find something to do with $240? I think we can all find something to do pretty nice for $240. The point is, but it wasn't a sacrifice of $20, or even if it's only $5, whatever. But learning to save really can be the basis for being successful. And then plan for opportunities that you can have in retirement. The other thing that I didn't stick on here, but in your bucket list, that might be also charitable giving. That might be doing some kind of humanitarian work somewhere in the world or whatever. Those kinds of things, you know, if we've managed, and if I have managed my money well enough, then when I do have more time, maybe than I have right now, I can go do those things. And I can feel good about, on a regular basis, donating and helping other people in my community. Because I've learned to save, and I have a fund to save for those kinds of things. That's part of my budget, is to be able to fund the food bank or other kinds of local charities or whatever. So that's the thing that I found that's important in my life, is to have a way to do that. So I love these two sayings. One's from Eleanor Roosevelt. She said that we need to enjoy the journey. The purpose of life is to live, to taste experience to the utmost, to reach out eagerly and without fear for newer and richer experiences. And then the trick is to enjoy life. Don't wish away your days waiting for better ones ahead. That's one of the things I think is really important, is that we need to learn to live now and to make the decisions now that will give us joy in our lives now. And, you know, my parents were great. We didn't travel a lot. As I was growing up on a dairy farm, it's really hard to find somebody to come milk 50 heads of cattle when we want to go on a vacation. So we didn't take very many. So I didn't learn to play as much as I wished I had. My parents played a lot in their retirement years, but they didn't play for a lot of years much. And I think that's important, that's healthy, is to find time to have a little bit of play in your life too. So, what I learned the hard way, because I didn't know those things that I've talked about, those 5 principles, it took me time to learn them. So I was kind of behind the 8 ball, right? I had to learn these techniques and these skills as an adult, and so I lost out on some of the opportunities I could have had I known those skills early on. So one of the things that I would really like to stress is that what you know, you teach others. Don't be afraid to talk to your kids and your friends and your neighbors and the kids that you come in contact with. Teach them about these money management principles and have conversation with them to the point where they can learn how to do this themselves. So they feel more confident growing up. They feel confident in handling their finances. Set some goals for your financial future now. That's one of the things I wished I had done a long time before I really did. Budget your money now and include a category for saving. Learn and practice retirement planning strategies, including investing now. Learn to use credit wisely. Don't become or remain a slave to interest. Learn to plan for that financial freedom that will allow you to enjoy life and realize your dreams. You know, I was talking to my 16-year-old grandson yesterday. He was at our house, and he's taking a financial literacy class. And we were talking about it. So what are you learning? Well, I'm learning that I need to learn how to save some money. And, you know, he has a car payment, and it's not a very big one, but he also has to pay insurance. And he said, it's really hard paying insurance and working and going to school and doing all those kinds of things. But having those conversations early on can really help kids even make good choices and decisions. And we were talking about, well, could he ride his bike to school instead of his car, because his car is an old car and it doesn't get good gas mileage. And he said, I just don't have much money for gas. So those are the kinds of things we can teach others. But I just want you to know in closing, you know, it's been a great life. And I have had a chance to learn from a lot of wonderful people some wonderful financial skills and techniques. But I wished I had learned some of those a lot earlier in my life. So I encourage you, just start where you are and try some of these things. like they said, Susan said early this morning, pick one or two that's maybe something that's just kind of tweaked your interest or made you think of something you can do more regularly that will make you effective in your life so that you can enjoy life, that you can be happy, and that you can feel financially stable and have a good, secure future. So thank you for your attention. Have a good day.